Hey guys, tonight we dive into the fevered streets of St. Petersburg, where the air itself seems to press down on the soul. It's July. The sun beats against the cobblestones like a judgment, and the buildings lean inward as if eavesdropping on every dark thought. A man walks alone, young, gaunt, dressed in rags that might once have been a student's coat. His name is Raskolnikov, and he's got murder on his mind. This book belongs to playlist level 5, Understanding Human Nature and Society. And what better fit than Crime and Punishment, a novel that slices deep into the psyche of man who believes himself above morality, only to be dismantled by his own conscience. This isn't just a crime story. It's a descent into madness, into guilt, into the terrifying clarity of self-awareness. Level 5 books peel away the lies we live by. They shine a light on social illusion, personal delusion, and the fragile line between genius and madness, rebellion and responsibility. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Always curious who else is out there in the quiet night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins with a mind in conflict. Raskolnikov, student, dreamer, and destitute, has been slipping deeper into philosophical obsession. He believes some men, extraordinary men, are above the law. Napoleon didn't ask permission to step over corpses, so why should he? But even as these thoughts flicker through his skull, he's racked with doubt, disgust, and a shame he can't quite name. He's been holed up in a tiny, suffocating room, practically unlivable, barely eating, barely sleeping. The city itself seems to crawl into his skin. That famous Dostoevskian humidity, the yellowing walls, the unrelenting noise of carts and people, it's all there to crush him just a little more. But on this particular day, he steps outside. He walks, not because he wants to, but because the weight in his chest is so great that if he doesn't move, it might kill him. As he walks through the hay-scented, sun-hammered streets of St. Petersburg, fragments of his philosophy come loose. His plan, his terrible, precise plan, is to kill Alyona Ivanovna, an old pawnbroker who exploits the poor. To him, she is useless, a parasite, and he tells himself, might be destined for greatness. This murder, he believes, will be a test, a way to separate himself from the herd. But Raskolnikov isn't a cold-blooded killer. Not yet. He's a student of contradictions, idealistic and cynical, arrogant and self-loathing. And the closer he gets to the act, the more these contradictions tear at him like claws. He visits a tavern and meets Marmeladov, a drunken former official who speaks with tragic eloquence about his daughter Sonia, a girl forced into prostitution to support her starving family. Raskolnikov listens, rapt, not knowing how deeply Sonia will later shape his own life. The next morning, everything sharpens. He's tested the waters, rationalized every angle. He knows the pawnbroker's schedule. He knows when her half-sister Lizaveta will be out. He prepares an axe and hides it beneath his coat. His pulse pounds. The heat presses against him like a second skin. And then he does it. He enters the building, climbs the stairs, knocks on the door. Alyona opens it, suspicious as always, but lets him in. He shows her a pledge, a worthless item, just to get her to turn. When she does, he raises the axe. The blow lands. She crumples. Time freezes. But then, the unexpected. Lizaveta returns too early. She opens the door and sees everything. She screams, but too late. Raskolnikov strikes again. Two women lie dead. His hands are shaking. He searches for valuables, finds a few trinkets, but barely focuses. His mind is collapsing. He forgets to take the money. His philosophical certainty dissolves into a kind of animal panic. He flees, bloodied, disoriented. He stumbles back to his room and hides the evidence, burying it beneath a rock in a courtyard. Then fever sets in. He collapses on his bed, unable to rise for days. This is where the punishment begins, not from the police, not yet, but from within. The mind that believed it could stand above morality has shattered. The world doesn't feel liberated or logical. It feels poisoned. Raskolnikov begins to unravel. He hallucinates. He dreams of the murder over and over, sometimes with surreal distortions. Dreams where the old woman laughs, where the axe is made of rubber, where he's caught over and over by crowds pointing and accusing. He stares at his own reflection, trying to recognize the man who did this. And outside his door, life continues. His friend Razumikin visits, full of warmth and concern, dragging him food and medicine. Razumikin is everything Raskolnikov isn't: stable, loyal, unpretentious. Their contrast becomes starker as Raskolnikov retreats deeper into himself. Then news arrives. There's a strange twist of fate. A pair of painters were in the building at the time of the murder. They saw someone, and the police are quietly sniffing around. But even with danger looming, Raskolnikov can't stay away from the scene. He returns to the building, like a moth circling the flame. The horror doesn't repel him. It draws him in. He listens to investigators. He even blurts out strange, self-incriminating remarks. It's as though part of him wants to be caught, while another part watches from a distance, stunned by his own behavior. And then, another blow. He receives a letter from his mother. His sister Dunya is being courted by a man named Luzin, a pompous bureaucrat. The proposal reeks of manipulation. He wants to marry a poor girl, so she'll be forever grateful and dependent. Raskolnikov is furious. He sees it as a repetition of suffering, a woman's dignity traded for survival. The world, he thinks, is built on such transactions, one class stepping on another, using love and sacrifice as currency. This is the psychology Dostoevsky constructs so masterfully. A man torn not just by guilt, but by the recognition of a brutal, unfair society. A man who's tried to play God, but is now choking on the consequences. And we're only beginning. Raskolnikov's world doesn't just spiral inward, it fractures. The axis on which he thought the world turned is now buckling under contradiction. He's not sleeping, barely eating, and yet there's a strange vitality in his madness. Days pass in a fever-drenched fog. He speaks to no one, then speaks to everyone. He wanders the streets, sometimes muttering to himself, other times staring at faces as though trying to read the meaning of life in a stranger's eyes. And in the middle of this chaos, he does something strange. He goes to the police station. It isn't about the murder, at least not directly. He's been summoned about a debt. But stepping into that space, the sterile walls, the glinting uniforms, the scratching of pens, something cracks. His pulse hammers. His mind floods with images of the pawnbroker's face, of Lizaveta's shock, of red spreading on wooden floors. He faints. The officers murmur. Something's off, but they don't yet connect the dots. Raskolnikov stumbles home, drenched in sweat and dread. The wall between him and exposure just got a little thinner. But then a ray of light, or something close. Razumikin returns. Razumikin, whose loyalty is perhaps too pure for a place like this, insists on helping his friend. He takes Raskolnikov home, practically carries him, fetches a doctor, tries to create a cocoon of normalcy around a man clearly unraveling. And yet, despite everything, Raskolnikov remains distant. He's aware of his friend's efforts, but cannot receive them. His shame curdles into pride, his pain into isolation. It's during this recovery that his family arrives. Pulcheria Alexandrovna, his mother, full of maternal worry and idealized hope, and Dunya, his strong, dignified sister. Their reunion is not joyful. It's thick with unsaid words and buried truths. Raskolnikov snaps at them, alienates them, confuses them. He sees their concern as judgment, their love as pressure. He can't bear to be seen through kind eyes. It sears too close to the bone. Meanwhile, the engagement between Dunya and Luzin looms. Raskolnikov despises Luzin. To him, Luzin is a parasite in another form, just like the pawnbroker, a man who wants to buy submission through security, who seeks virtue only if it's accompanied by dependence. The comparison may not be fair, but that's how Raskolnikov sees it. To him, this isn't just a family matter. It's a continuation of the moral rut he tried to cut out with an axe. Things escalate. There's a dinner. Tense. Stifling. Luzin condescends. Dunya remains calm, but firm. Raskolnikov explodes. Words become weapons. Insults fly like shattered glass. And then, without warning, Raskolnikov walks out. Into the streets again. Into the noise and stink and blur of humanity. He isn't fleeing exactly. He's searching, not for escape, but perhaps for confirmation, that he's still alive, that his ideas haven't betrayed him. This is where he finds Sonia again. Sonia, the daughter of Marmeladov, the drunkard who once sobbed to Raskolnikov about his broken family. Now orphaned, now alone. She's small, almost fragile, yet something about her radiates an unbreakable softness. She doesn't speak much, but when she does, there's no judgment in her tone, only understanding. Her suffering doesn't harden her, it refines her. They talk. He's curious about her, how she survives, how she reconciles her faith with the life she leads. She tells him about the gospel, about hope. He listens, but with the guarded skepticism of a man too burned to believe in light. Still, something in her presence unsettles him, not in the way the police do, but in a way that makes him feel seen. The novel begins to layer its themes more overtly now. Guilt and grace, punishment and redemption. The lines between earthly law and moral law blur. Raskolnikov, who once believed in cold rationality, begins to sense that there may be other forces at play, forces that cannot be measured, predicted, or escaped. Then, enter Porfiry Petrovich, the investigator. Unlike the caricature of a policeman, Porfiry is calm, intellectual, even friendly. But there's something wolf-like in his gaze. He circles, probes, smiles. He plays psychological chess. asking Raskolnikov seemingly benign questions, all while observing the flickers behind his eyes. Their first conversation is both disarming and electric. Porphyry suggests a theory that extraordinary people might be allowed to transgress the law if it serves a greater purpose. He claims it's hypothetical, but Raskolnikov feels the bait. He answers carefully, but his mind races. Does Porphyry know? Is he testing him? Or simply toying with ideas? It's a brilliant move. Porphyry aligns himself with Raskolnikov's own theories, then waits to see how the accused reacts to his own reflection. Meanwhile, another dark figure lurks, Svidrigailov. Svidrigailov once pursued Dunya obsessively, and his reappearance is no coincidence. He's rich, morally decayed, and deeply enigmatic. He offers to help Dunya, but his motives are unclear. He's drawn to Raskolnikov, too, sensing something kindred in the boy's darkness. But while Raskolnikov teeters between ruin and redemption, Svidrigailov has long since crossed into the abyss. We're now in the middle of the book, and the temperature has dropped, not just literally, as the Petersburg summer fades into the damp chill of early autumn, but emotionally. Every relationship now pulses with subtext. Every action feels like a veiled confession. The city becomes a character. Its alleyways echo with secrets. Its courtyards breathe suspicion. Raskolnikov can't hide within it, only reflect it more deeply. And at the edge of all this, Sonia waits. She doesn't push him, doesn't try to fix him, but her steady presence, her resilience, her softness, becomes the novel's spiritual counterweight. She is the quiet that might still heal a man who's forgotten how to listen. But not yet. The guilt still pulses beneath his skin. And the punishment, well, the punishment has only just begun. The city seems to draw tighter around Raskolnikov, as if Petersburg itself has become a noose, silent, waiting. In the hazy hours between dusk and dawn, his fever lifts and returns like a tide, but the torment remains constant. It's not the fear of being caught that gnaws at him anymore. It's the realization that punishment has already begun, and it is not of the legal kind. His dreams become more vivid, more terrifying. In one, a horse is beaten to death by a drunken crowd, and the child version of Raskolnikov watches, screaming. It's grotesque and deeply symbolic, unmistakably echoing the violence he committed, but also showing a fracture between innocence and the brutal adult world he's now part of. This is the novel whispering. Guilt isn't a consequence of justice. It is justice. And through it all, Porphyry hovers. Their second meeting is even more unsettling than the first. Porphyry is all politeness, lounging in his chair like a cat full of cream. But his eyes never stop moving, reading, calculating. This time, there's less theory and more insinuation. He mentions clues, footprints, witnesses, odd behaviors. He's not accusing Raskolnikov. Not yet. But the trap is closing. Not with metal teeth, but with logic, patience, and silence. Raskolnikov plays along, but inside, he's unraveling. His voice shakes, his hands tremble. Porphyry smiles. Later, when they part, Raskolnikov feels hunted, exposed, and yet also weirdly relieved. There's a part of him that wants to confess, that aches to end this unbearable weight. But there's more to live through before absolution becomes possible. He returns to Sonia. This time, something has shifted. He opens up. Not fully, not yet, but enough. He speaks of his suffering, of feeling like he has crossed some line that can't be uncrossed. Sonia listens, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes wide but steady. And when she finally responds, she doesn't offer comfort. She offers faith. She tells him about Lazarus, the man Christ raised from the dead. The metaphor is clear. Even after decay, after death, resurrection is possible. Not just for the body, but for the soul. Raskolnikov doesn't believe, but he listens. Meanwhile, Svidrigailov becomes more present and more dangerous. He's watching everything. He visits Sonia. He spies on Raskolnikov. He tries to manipulate Dunya with promises of wealth and freedom. But Dunya, despite everything, holds her ground. Her moral compass may waver in private, but it never falters when it matters. She refuses him, and Svidrigailov, faced with a woman he cannot own, begins to spiral further into darkness. Raskolnikov is pushed further by Porfiry, who finally drops the game. In a startling move, Porfiry reveals that he knows. He doesn't have proof, but he has certainty, and that certainty is enough. He offers Raskolnikov a choice: confess and reclaim your humanity, or wait for the law to crush you entirely. It's not a threat, it's an invitation. And here, Dostoevsky plays his most delicate chord, because punishment in this book is not imprisonment. It's alienation, guilt, disintegration of the soul. And Porfiry brilliantly offers a paradox. Confessing is the only way to regain your freedom, even if it leads to a cell. Raskolnikov doesn't confess. Not yet, but he's shaken, deeply. He runs again, mentally, emotionally, physically. But his escape ends where it began, with Sonia. This time, he tells her everything. It is a moment of quiet devastation. He sits, trembling. She listens without flinching. He tells her about the acts, the blood, the chaos, the justifications. She cries, not for herself, not in fear, but for him, because now she sees the full weight he's been carrying. She doesn't turn away. She doesn't scream. Instead, she places her hand on his and tells him that he is not beyond redemption. She begs him to confess. He refuses, but he's moved deeply. Something inside him shifts, like frost melting just enough to let light through. And then, one final twist, Svidrigailov overhears. He now knows Raskolnikov's secret, and what he does next is as shocking as it is prophetic. He doesn't blackmail him. He doesn't expose him. Instead, Svidrigailov begins his own unraveling. He gives away money, leaves part of it to Sonia and her siblings. He meets with Dunya, once more trying to convince her, and when she refuses again, this time with a gun in her hand, he walks away, silent. That night, he wanders the city, alone, haunted, hollowed, and in the early morning light, as the city stirs from its slumber, Svidrigailov takes his own life. A man who embraced moral freedom without conscience, who lived without guilt or grace, ends by choosing silence forever. Raskolnikov is left reeling, not just by the death, but by what it represents. The end of a man who lived his theory to the extreme. A man who killed his conscience and then found no reason to keep going. The mirror is sharp, and it's time to look into it. Raskolnikov, with Sonia at his side, walks to the police station. It is not an act of defeat. It is the first act of rebirth. He confesses. Not with flair, not with drama, but with weariness and resolve. And as the city swallows him up once more, this time behind bars, something flickers in his eyes that wasn't there before. Not freedom, but the beginning of peace. Now the story slips across time, into Siberia, vast, cold, and seemingly infinite. A land where silence reigns, and each gust of wind feels like it's sweeping away memory. This is where Raskolnikov finds himself, sentenced to penal servitude. But more than a punishment, this place becomes the crucible in which the remnants of his soul are tested and perhaps slowly remade. Sonia follows him. Yes, she leaves everything behind: poverty, her siblings, what little stability she clung to in Petersburg, and travels to be near him. Not to save him, not to lecture him, just to sit quietly in the same shadow, to offer her presence as a kind of faith, a symbol that someone still believes he's worth waiting for. At first, Raskolnikov resents her presence. He's curt, withdrawn, sometimes even cruel. He believes he deserves the weight of solitude, of despair. But Sonia does not demand his love or his repentance. She simply exists near him, visiting when she can, working when she must. She brings a fragile thread of humanity into the icy, gray monotony of the camp. Slowly, so slowly it's almost imperceptible at first, he begins to soften, not through epiphany or miracles, but through small acts. Watching Sonia walk through the snow to bring him bread, observing the other prisoners with their own stories of shame, loss, and survival. He starts to see them, not as abstractions, but as people, just like the pawnbroker, just like her sister, just like himself. Dostoevsky is not interested in simple redemption arcs. No, a moment arrives where Raskolnikov falls to his knees and embraces the light. Instead, he walks through darkness, learns to listen again, to wonder again, to hope, maybe. And in this strange and frigid land, spring arrives. This final image is not just seasonal, it's symbolic. The ground, hardened and numb for so long, begins to soften. Buds push up through frozen dirt. Life insists on continuing. And within Raskolnikov, something stirs. He begins to look at Sonia differently, not with resistance, but with reverence. She's not just a girl with faith. She's the embodiment of grace. Unasked, unforced, unwavering. And then one morning, sitting beside her by the river, he breaks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but he reaches for her hand. And for the first time, he weeps not from guilt, but from the possibility that life could still mean something, that he is still alive, that perhaps love is stronger than logic. Now let's step back and reflect on why this novel belongs to level 5, understanding human nature and society. Crime and punishment isn't just a psychological thriller. It's a philosophical excavation, a work that strips the human soul bare, not for spectacle, but to explore one of the oldest questions: what makes a person good? Raskolnikov's crime is not simply murder. It is the idea behind the act. He believes that some people, extraordinary people, are entitled to transcend moral law, that for a Napoleon or a Caesar, ordinary rules do not apply. The murder is merely a test of this hypothesis. But what Dostoevsky shows us is that conscience is not a social construct. It is embedded, unavoidable. Even in the absence of legal consequences, guilt persists like a ghost. Raskolnikov cannot rationalize away his humanity, and in trying to do so, he fractures himself. This is a story about justice, yes, but not the justice of courtrooms. It is spiritual justice, psychological justice, a kind that reaches deeper than statutes and verdicts. Punishment is not delivered by men in robes. It is delivered by the weight of moral truth. Sonia represents something more than piety. She embodies suffering with dignity. Her existence challenges every utilitarian argument Raskolnikov tries to make. She is poor, broken, humiliated, but radiant. Through her, we see that virtue isn't a luxury. It's an act of quiet rebellion against despair. And Porfiry? He's more than a detective. He is a modern Socratic figure, forcing introspection without ever lifting a weapon. He wins not with evidence, but with understanding. He knows that confession, when voluntary, is not surrender, it's resurrection. Svidrigailov, by contrast, is the cautionary tale. The man without conscience, without faith, without love. He proves that without some deeper tether, morality, spirituality, human connection, freedom becomes meaningless. In his final act, he acknowledges this in the most tragic way possible. Even the setting of the novel, St. Petersburg, is a character of its own. Dark, wet, claustrophobic. It presses in on Raskolnikov like a physical embodiment of his mental state. The squalor, the cold, the unending fog, all echo his spiritual sickness. And when he moves to Siberia, the change in landscape reflects his slow inner thawing. Dostoevsky wrote this book not just in the aftermath of his own suffering, including imprisonment and a mock execution, but in the face of rising materialist philosophies in 19th century Russia. The novel becomes his answer to the growing idea that logic, reason, and utilitarianism could replace moral and spiritual truths. It's his warning. You could try to build a world without God, without conscience, without soul, but you will end up building a graveyard. So why does this novel endure? Because we still live in a world of Raskolnikovs, bright, idealistic, disconnected from moral grounding, obsessed with systems but blind to the soul. We still wrestle with the question, who decides what is right? What happens when guilt doesn't come from the outside, but from within? And we still need Sonias. People who love through silence, who stay even when the world turns gray, who remind us that no one is too far gone for grace. Crime and punishment is not easy. It's not comforting, but it is deeply necessary because it dares to ask, what if punishment is not the end of a life, but the beginning of becoming truly human? What makes crime and punishment endure, not just as a work of literature, but as a vessel of truth, is how seamlessly Dostoevsky weds the brutal and the beautiful. He leads us not only through the narrow alleys of Petersburg or the frost-bitten silence of Siberia, but through the most treacherous corridors of the human heart. And we follow him willingly, because somewhere within us, we know this is not just Raskolnikov's story. It's ours. Let's take a step back. Let's slow down and look at the architecture of this novel, brick by trembling brick. At its surface, it is a crime novel. A young man, destitute and disillusioned, murders a pawnbroker. Then the psychological unraveling begins. But unlike most crime stories, the mystery isn't who did it, it's why. And more chillingly, what now? From the very first page, we're invited into a mind already on the edge. Raskolnikov is not a calculating criminal, but a man gnawed from within. His intellect has outpaced his soul. He believes, or wants to believe, that some men are born with the right to step over moral lines if they serve a higher good. That idea, the extraordinary man theory, isn't just philosophical window dressing. It's the dagger the book holds to the throat of modernity. What happens when reason is severed from compassion? When we elevate the abstract above the human? Dostoevsky doesn't answer with a treatise. He answers with blood. And it's no coincidence that the first victim is a pawnbroker, someone who represents, however grimly, the economy of desperation. Her apartment, filled with odds and ends, pledges and broken promises, is a vault of suffering. And yet, she is still a person. Her sister, Lizaveta, is still a person. And when Raskolnikov kills them, the question isn't whether they were good or bad. It's whether he's crossed a threshold he can ever return from. The narrative structure mirrors this descent. The first part of the book is feverish, claustrophobic. The city pulses with heat and sickness. The streets sweat. Conversations stammer and repeat. And then the middle act loosens just slightly, letting in characters like Sonia, like Porfiry, like Razumikin. People who, in different ways, stand in contrast to Raskolnikov's isolating theories. Porfiry Petrovich, the magistrate, is one of Dostoevsky's most brilliant creations. He's not just a clever foil. He is the embodiment of conscience cloaked in reason. He doesn't pounce. He doesn't accuse. He waits. He understands something essential. That guilt is not a problem to be solved, but a fire that burns inward. He simply fans it. Then there's Sonia. Sonia. Some have dismissed her as saintly, too pure. But they miss the point. Sonia is not simple. She is strong. She walks through her own hell, selling herself not out of sin, but sacrifice. She reads the Bible in dim light. She clings to love like it's the last rope left. And most importantly, she sees Raskolnikov, not as a monster, but as someone who has forgotten he is human. Her presence is the moral heart of the novel. She never argues. She never preaches. She just stands quietly in the burning room. And somehow, by her presence alone, she makes Raskolnikov remember what warmth feels like. We also can't ignore the social dimension. This is not just a story of one man's crisis. It's a critique of a system that breeds such crises. The Russian Empire of Dostoevsky's time was one of inequality, alienation, urban sprawl, and philosophical confusion. Intellectuals debated utilitarianism and socialism while the poor starved in stairwells. The city, St. Petersburg, is both setting and symbol, a place built on Western ideals, but rotting from within. Dostoevsky saw what happens when ideology replaces empathy. He saw what happens when systems ask men to become cogs instead of souls. But here's where it gets personal, because he lived it. Dostoevsky himself was once a radical. He was sentenced to death for his role in a socialist circle. At the last moment, his sentence was commuted. He spent years in Siberian exile, surrounded by murderers and thieves. And it changed him, not into a cynic, but into a seer. He returned not with hatred for the world, but with eyes wide open to its contradictions, its chaos, and its grace. In Crime and Punishment, You feel that lived experience. You feel it in the trembling dialogues, in the quiet moral victories, in the moments when a man, having killed, begins to long for sunlight again. There are other characters, too, who reflect fractured parts of Raskolnikov's psyche. Svidrigailov, the hedonist and manipulator, is perhaps the most terrifying figure in the book, not because of what he does, but because he almost understands. He sees the moral void, and instead of fighting it, he jumps in. His fate is not one of redemption, but resignation. Razumikin, by contrast, is the everyman, kind, practical, loyal, a vision of who Raskolnikov might have been, had he trusted in love instead of logic. Through Razumikin, we see that normalcy is not weakness, it's salvation. And so, as we move deeper into the book's soul, we see it is not merely a tale of crime or punishment, but of resurrection. It dares to ask, what happens when a man breaks the sacred bond of life? Can he be forgiven? Can he forgive himself? In the next section, we'll let the answers unfold, quietly like snow on the Neva. And now, we arrive at the slow curve of redemption, not the clean, radiant kind sung about in hymns, but the gritty, hesitant kind that smells of stale bread and wet boots. Because redemption, in crime and punishment, does not descend like a dove. It limps, bruised and doubting, through the cold streets of Petersburg. The murder has been committed. The fever has passed. But the real punishment has only just begun. Raskolnikov drifts. He wanders through days that no longer seem his. The enormity of what he's done does not hit him like lightning. It creeps in, one uneasy silence at a time. He isolates himself from Razumikin. He pushes away his mother and sister. Even his thoughts grow hostile to his presence. He becomes a stranger to himself. And it is in this dislocation that Dostoevsky begins to gently lay the groundwork for transformation. Because punishment, in his view, is not administered by courts or chains. It is experienced inwardly. Raskolnikov is not imprisoned by law, but by his own soul. His belief in the extraordinary man theory begins to wither, not because someone proves it wrong, but because he cannot live with it. There's a moment, subtle and quiet, when he visits the murder scene again. He stands in the old woman's apartment, now cleaned, now occupied by someone else, and suddenly the air collapses on him. The world is unchanged, but he is not. That disconnect, that unbearable normalcy, is the true consequence of evil. And yet, even in his worst moments, he is not alone. Sonia remains, a constant, not because she is stubborn, but because she understands something he does not yet, that no soul is beyond reach. She invites him to read the Bible, specifically the story of Lazarus, another man who died and was called back to life. She doesn't force it. She merely opens the door. And that, right there, is the miracle of the novel. Dostoevsky doesn't give us a blinding conversion. He gives us Sonia holding an old, worn book in a dim room. A woman who has every reason to hate life, quietly choosing to believe in it. The pivotal turning point comes not in a courtroom, but in a whisper. Porfiry Petrovich finally confronts Raskolnikov, but he doesn't arrest him. Instead, he lays bare what he knows, gently, almost lovingly. He speaks of guilt, of the burden of hiding. He says, "Confess, and you will find rest." He sees Raskolnikov's pride, but he also sees the pain it conceals. And so, after much internal war, Raskolnikov kneels. Not before a judge, not yet, but in front of Sonia. He tells her everything. She weeps, not with anger, but relief. Because truth has entered the room. Not justice, not vengeance, just truth. It is not glamorous. When Raskolnikov finally turns himself in, there is no grand speech, no crowd gasping. He does it simply like a man who is laying down a weight he can no longer carry. And he is sentenced to Siberia. Ah, Siberia, a land of snow and silence. But also, in Dostoevsky's mythology, a place of cleansing. Sonia follows him. She sells everything, leaves everyone. She walks beside him, not as a reward for confession, but as an expression of love that transcends judgment. And it is here, far from Petersburg, that Raskolnikov begins to see what he once could not, the quiet dignity of suffering. He resents it first. He mocks the other prisoners. He refuses to see himself as one of them. But day by day, something inside him shifts. Not dramatically, just enough for him to notice a blade of grass by the prison fence. Just enough to sit with Sonia without shame. The ending of Crime and Punishment is not one of triumph. It is one of opening. Raskolnikov does not become a saint. He does not undo what he has done, but he begins to feel again. And in Dostoevsky's world, that is everything. Because if Crime and Punishment teaches us anything, it is that conscience is not a curse. It is a gift. It wounds us not to destroy, but to wake us up. And through that pain, if we're lucky, we find our way back to others. And isn't that the deepest truth of all? That no man is an island. That even our worst sins do not sever us from the possibility of grace. That somewhere, even in the coldest part of the world, someone might be waiting to read us the story of Lazarus. In the next section, we'll explore the broader implications of this arc. What Dostoevsky may have been saying to his own generation and to us. But for now, just linger here in the stillness of the prison yard with the snow falling gently and Sonia's shadow beside him. The snowfall outside that Siberian prison may seem like the final image of Crime and Punishment, but in truth, it's just the beginning of what this novel has to tell us. Not just about one man's descent and return, but about the nature of society, morality, and human suffering itself. Because Fyodor Dostoevsky didn't write Crime and Punishment merely to tell the story of Raskolnikov. He wrote it to speak to something larger, something endemic to humanity. A question that gnaws at every generation. What does it mean to be good in a broken world? Now, let's pull back the curtain just slightly and examine the philosophical layers woven into the tapestry of this novel. At the heart of Raskolnikov's theory that so-called extraordinary men have the right to transgress moral laws for the sake of progress is a direct confrontation with utilitarian logic. He's convinced that history is shaped not by ordinary people, but by rare individuals who act beyond good and evil. In this framework, Napoleon becomes not a tyrant, but a visionary. The old pawnbroker? Just a casualty of advancement. But Dostoevsky dismantles this idea, not with rhetoric, but with suffering. Because Raskolnikov, in attempting to step outside the moral code, doesn't find liberation, he finds torment. His internal anguish becomes the refutation. The human conscience, in Dostoevsky's world, is not a social construct. It's sacred. You can deny it, but you cannot silence it. To kill is to violate something essential, not in society, but in the self. This is the first great philosophical lesson of the novel. Morality is not circumstantial. It's integral to being human. And then, of course, there's the social critique. The Petersburg of crime and punishment is not just a setting. It's a character in itself. Crumbling tenements, oppressive heat, filthy alleys. The city is a physical manifestation of decay, moral, social, economic. People are either starving or drunk, proud or broken. This isn't just Russia in 1866. It's a diagnosis of urban modernity. Dostoevsky was deeply concerned with the rising tide of rationalism, socialism, and atheism sweeping through intellectual circles in his time. He saw the allure of these ideologies, especially for the poor and desperate, but he also saw the danger, the reduction of man to a mere function, economic, political, biological. In Crime and Punishment, the rejection of spiritual truth leads not to freedom, but to madness. Raskolnikov's descent is not just personal, it's symbolic. He is what happens when ideology severs itself from compassion. When theory tramples over the trembling hands of the human being in front of us. But Dostoevsky isn't entirely pessimistic. He doesn't suggest we abandon thought or theory. Rather, he invites us to remember that wisdom must be married to love, that true justice cannot exist without grace. Enter Sonia. She is perhaps the most radical character in the novel, not because she preaches revolution, but because she lives mercy. A girl forced into prostitution to feed her family, yet she maintains a soul untainted by bitterness. She represents the Christian ideal not as dogma, but as lived, embodied compassion. She listens, she forgives, and most importantly, she stays. Dostoevsky seems to say, here is your extraordinary person, not the one who dares to kill in the name of progress, but the one who dares to love in the name of suffering. And what of Porfiry the detective? Ah, here is a man of paradoxes, intellectually sharp, psychologically agile, yet profoundly humane. He doesn't seek Raskolnikov's downfall, he seeks his salvation. In one of their final conversations, he even expresses pity. He knows what drives this young man. He understands that punishment, true punishment, is already underway. Porfiry represents a justice system that does not merely punish crime, but aims to restore the soul. In this way, he mirrors Sonia. Both are agents of grace, though from different worlds, law and love, reason and faith. It's this convergence that gives the novel its enduring power. In the end, Crime and Punishment isn't just about murder or guilt. It's about the tension between intellect and morality, pride and humility, despair and hope. The deeper question Dostoevsky asks is not, what do we do with criminals, but what do we do with brokenness? His answer, whispered through snowflakes and tear-streaked faces, is astonishingly simple. We walk beside it. In our next section, we'll take a step further into the character arcs, especially Raskolnikov's transformation in Siberia, and what that tells us about human capacity for renewal. But for now, just breathe in this realization that punishment without love is vengeance, and love without justice is naivete. Dostoevsky gives us both, held in delicate tension, like a candle flickering in a storm. What makes Dostoevsky's writing so hauntingly immersive? Why does crime and punishment draw us, and not with page-turning plot twists, but with an almost unbearable closeness to the mind of its protagonist? The answer lies in Dostoevsky's extraordinary use of interiority. The entire novel moves in rhythmic waves between Raskolnikov's outer world, the noise of streets, the stifling heat, the glances of strangers, and his inner world, filled with jagged thoughts, feverish guilt, and philosophical spirals. The real action, more often than not, is psychological. He writes in a style that defies easy summary. Long, winding sentences mirror a man unable to finish a thought without second-guessing it. Descriptions slide seamlessly into hallucinations, and the line between reality and anxiety is often blurred. Yet that's what makes it feel so real, so claustrophobically honest. Let's not forget the physical settings. St. Petersburg itself is almost a character in the novel. The narrow alleys, the oppressive air, the smell of poverty, the noise of carts and boots and rain. It's not the romanticized Russia of snow-covered fields and candlelit chalets. It's urban, squalid, reeking with contradiction. When Raskolnikov walks the streets, he's not just pacing geographically, he's pacing morally. Every building he passes, every drunkard muttering in the corner, every overheard argument, all of it adds to the pressure building inside him. The city is not a backdrop. It's the crucible. And then there's Dostoevsky's dialogue, absolutely riveting in its intensity. Characters in this novel rarely talk for the sake of talking. Their words are charged, desperate, often elliptical. Conversations become duels. Take Porfiry, the investigator. He doesn't accuse Raskolnikov outright. Instead, he uses the Socratic method, gently poking, probing, inviting contradiction. He knows Raskolnikov is the killer long before he confesses, but he wants Raskolnikov to know it too, to own it. Every time these two face off, it's like watching a psychological chess match where only one player realizes he's being checkmated. And Sonia, how different her words feel. Sparse, broken, full of humility and hope. When she reads the story of Lazarus to Raskolnikov, it's not a performance. It's an act of love, even sacrifice. Her voice becomes a counterweight to the cacophony in his head. And because she speaks little, when she does speak, it lands like a bell in the silence. The novel's structure also reflects its psychological core. It's broken into 6 parts and an epilogue, and each part is like a descent into a new circle of moral confusion. There are no clean breaks, no convenient cliffhangers. Dostoevsky flows from one moment to the next with unsettling continuity. Like life, the chapters refuse to compartmentalize experience. Let's take a moment now to discuss some recurring symbols. The axe, of course, is a literal weapon, but symbolically it's cold, impersonal, almost cowardly. Raskolnikov uses it precisely because it allows distance. He doesn't stab or strangle. He swings, a motion mechanical and dehumanizing. It's the tool of someone trying not to feel. Blood, too, plays a recurring role. Not just in the scene of the murder, but later in dreams and hallucinations. It becomes a metaphor for spiritual contamination. Raskolnikov can wash his hands, but the stain remains internal. And then there's the motif of sickness. Raskolnikov is feverish through much of the book, a condition both physical and symbolic. His illness reflects a diseased moral compass, a mind burning with contradictions. Dostoevsky blurs the line between disease and guilt until it becomes hard to tell where the body ends and the soul begins. Even money takes on layered meaning. Poverty here is not merely economic. It's existential. Raskolnikov's squalid condition, his lack of food, his unwashed clothes, they are not just signs of destitution, but of moral erosion. He is disconnected from the human community in every possible way. And that's the spiritual heart of Dostoevsky's vision. For him, crime is not merely an infraction, it's alienation, a step away from others, a severing of the self from the shared human experience. And punishment? It's not just jail. It's the unbearable solitude that comes when you no longer believe you belong. Yet Dostoevsky never leaves us there. His greatest strength, perhaps, is his refusal to surrender to despair. For all the torment, all the darkness, there remains a thread of hope. Not naive, not easy, but luminous. And it often shows itself in the smallest gestures. A glance, a hand held, a prayer. This is why his writing has endured. Not because he explained the human soul, but because he illuminated its paradoxes. Because sometimes the greatest punishment is not what society imposes, but what conscience reveals. And sometimes the path back to light begins not with understanding, but with surrender. In the next sections, we'll dive into how Dostoevsky's own life, political beliefs, and spiritual philosophy shaped crime and punishment. How his experience with prison, his flirtation with atheism, and his return to Orthodox Christianity all bled into the pages of this novel, making it not just a book, but a personal act of redemption. Let's step back for a moment, because to fully understand the magnitude of crime and punishment, we have to understand the man behind it. Fyodor Dostoevsky was not writing this novel from a place of abstract theory or comfortable distance. He was writing from the raw edge of experience, from the deep grooves of a soul that had lived through its own crucible. Born in 1821 in Moscow, Dostoevsky grew up in a household marked by intensity and conflict. His father, a retired military surgeon, was a rigid and at times brutal man. His mother was more tender, but sickly. The young Fyodor retreated into books, especially the Bible and works by Shakespeare, Schiller, and Pushkin. But it wasn't just literature that shaped him. It was the ache of life itself. Early exposure to poverty, death, and injustice became the soil from which his fiction would later grow. And then came the turning point. In 1849, Dostoevsky was arrested for his involvement in a literary circle that discussed banned political texts, works that questioned the Tsarist regime. He was sentenced to death. He and several others were taken to the firing squad, blindfolded, told they had minutes to live. But at the last second, literally the last second, the execution was called off. The entire thing had been a staged punishment ordered by the Tsar to frighten the prisoners. Instead, Dostoevsky was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia. Those 4 years broke and remade him. Gone was the young radical enthralled with Western rationalism. In its place emerged a deeply spiritual man, someone who had stared into the abyss and come out believing in the redemptive power of suffering. Not because it was pleasant, but because it stripped away illusion. Siberia had shown him what men could become without hope and what they might become with it. It's no exaggeration to say that crime and punishment is a distillation of that transformation. You can feel it in every paragraph. In Raskolnikov's fevered dreams, in the paradoxical dignity of the poor, in Sonia's trembling faith, in Marmeladov's broken, bloated confessions. It's all there, the abyss and the flicker of light within it. Dostoevsky was fascinated by the great question of his age. If God is dead, what replaces him? Can man construct a moral code based purely on reason? What happens when individuals begin to see themselves as beyond good and evil, above society, above law, above conscience? Raskolnikov's theory that extraordinary men are allowed to commit crimes for the greater good isn't just a plot device. It's a philosophical grenade thrown into the heart of Enlightenment thinking. Napoleon, after all, waged war and reshaped Europe. Millions died, but history calls him great. Why not Raskolnikov? Dostoevsky's answer is chillingly clear. Because greatness without humility corrodes the soul. His writing is not anti-intellectual, but it is deeply skeptical of cold rationalism when severed from compassion. Raskolnikov is brilliant. He reasons, calculates, strategizes, but he is not whole. His mind and his heart are at war. And in Dostoevsky's universe, that war is where tragedy is born. Which brings us to Sonia again, because she is not just a contrast. She is a spiritual anchor. Sonia is poor. She's forced into prostitution to support her family. She barely speaks, but her silence is not emptiness, it's strength. She believes in love, in sacrifice, in resurrection. She reads the gospel not to preach, but to live. And she never judges Raskolnikov. She sees him fully. The murderer, the dreamer, the lost child. And it is through her unwavering presence, that he begins slowly, painfully to crack open. When Raskolnikov finally confesses, not just to the police, but to Sonia, it's not a surrender of logic. It's a surrender of pride. He kneels. She cries. It is not dramatic. It is sacred. Dostoevsky doesn't end the novel with grand fireworks. He gives us an epilogue in a Siberian prison camp. There, we see Raskolnikov begin a new journey, not toward escape or redemption in a grand public sense, but toward love. Quiet, steady, human love. And this is where Dostoevsky is most profound. He doesn't tell us the world can be fixed. He doesn't promise that crime will vanish or that punishment will always heal. But he does show us that even the most broken among us can choose humility, can find God not in church or ideology, but in the act of kneeling before another human being and saying, I was wrong. The book ends not with certainty, but with possibility. This, perhaps, is Dostoevsky's greatest gift, the refusal to flatten human beings into arguments or archetypes. Everyone in crime and punishment is contradictory. Porfiry is both cunning and compassionate. Marmeladov is both tragic and ridiculous. Raskolnikov is both a monster and a child. And that's the truth, isn't it? We are all split, all torn between darkness and light. What Dostoevsky offers is not a clean resolution, but a mirror, a gentle, terrifying, sacred mirror. One that says, look, you are not alone in your confusion. You are not damned by your mistakes. You are simply human. In our final sections, we'll explore how crime and punishment reshaped literature itself, and why it continues to haunt classrooms, bookshelves, and hearts over 150 years later. By the time Dostoevsky published Crime and Punishment in 1866, he had not only re-entered the literary scene, he had redefined it. This was no ordinary novel. It was a philosophical earthquake, and its aftershocks are still felt in world literature today. Let's talk about why. First, Dostoevsky didn't merely tell stories. He created laboratories of the human soul. His characters aren't just fictional constructs. They're living ideas in conflict. Raskolnikov isn't merely a murderer. He's a walking hypothesis. What if man could be God? What if conscience were just a social invention? And then, page by page, Dostoevsky tests that hypothesis in the most rigorous way possible, through suffering. This is the blueprint for modern psychological fiction. Long before Freud named the ID, ego, and superego, Dostoevsky was already dramatizing them. His internal monologues, his dream sequences, his spiraling mental breakdowns. These are not narrative flourishes. They are surgical instruments, tools to dissect the soul. And in doing so, Dostoevsky elevated the novel to something closer to philosophy, even theology. Think of the influence. Would Kafka's Gregor Samsa, waking up as a bug, be possible without Raskolnikov's paranoid wanderings? Would Camus' Assault and the Stranger exist without Raskolnikov's cold arithmetic of life and death? Even Virginia Woolf's stream of consciousness or Faulkner's fragmented voices, Dostoevsky paved the way. But his influence isn't just literary. It's moral. In a world that increasingly categorizes people as winners or losers, criminals or heroes, Dostoevsky complicates everything. He reminds us that every human life, no matter how broken, is full of infinite possibility. That people aren't only their worst moments. That beneath violence, arrogance, shame, there can still be tenderness, vulnerability, redemption. Let's turn now to his prose style. Dostoevsky's writing isn't polished in a classical sense. It's raw, urgent, sometimes clumsy. He'll repeat words, interrupt himself, shift tone mid-sentence. But that's the point. He isn't crafting marble statues. He's capturing living minds. Turbulent, unstable, real. And his pacing? It defies convention. Whole chapters may pass in psychological introspection. Then a single line will deliver a gut punch. He knelt down in the middle of the square, bowed to the earth, and kissed it. Quiet, devastating, redemptive. Critics have often noted that Dostoevsky's novels feel like sacred texts, not because they preach, but because they struggle. They ask hard questions and resist easy answers. They are not manuals for salvation, but companions in the search for it. In Crime and Punishment, this search is most poignantly symbolized by the Lazarus story. When Sonia reads Raskolnikov, the passage about Lazarus being raised from the dead, it's not just a spiritual reference. It's a challenge, a whisper of hope. Can Raskolnikov, too, rise? Can anyone? Dostoevsky doesn't show us the resurrection, but he gestures toward it. And in that gesture lies a universe of meaning. Let's pause on this. The punishment in Crime and Punishment is not merely legal. Raskolnikov's greatest suffering occurs before he sets foot in prison. It's internal, a silent unraveling. He becomes ghost-like, disconnected from the world, barely alive. And that's the brilliance of Dostoevsky's vision. Punishment begins the moment we fracture from truth. But, and this matters, it doesn't have to be the end. Sonia's love is not naive. It's fierce, steady, forgiving. She is the embodiment of grace. And grace, in Dostoevsky's world, is not earned. It's offered, freely, quietly, often undeservedly. Through her, Dostoevsky tells us, you are not beyond redemption. No matter what you've done, no matter how far you've wandered, there is still a path. It may be narrow, painful, long, but it exists. This is why the novel endures. Not because it flatters us, but because it confronts us and then gives us the courage to go on. Because it says what few stories dare to say, that morality without mercy is tyranny. That intellect without compassion is cruelty. That truth, real truth, is never clean, but always healing. In our next section, we'll look deeper into how readers and critics over generations have interpreted crime and punishment. From revolutionary students in Russia to existential philosophers in France, and to readers like you and me, lying in the quiet dark, wondering what it all means. From the moment it was published in 1866, Crime and Punishment was more than a novel. It was a cultural event. Russian readers devoured it, critics argued over it, and writers for generations would wrestle with its legacy. But what exactly has made this novel persist across borders, centuries, and ideologies? Let's begin with the Russian reaction. At the time of its release, Tsarist Russia was facing a profound identity crisis. Modernization loomed. Serfdom had just been abolished in 1861. New ideas, liberalism, socialism, nihilism, flooded in like an ideological storm. Young intellectuals, especially university students, began questioning everything: tradition, religion, government, even the moral fabric of society. Dostoevsky knew these young men. He had been one of them, and in Raskolnikov, he gave them a terrifying mirror. Many of Dostoevsky's contemporaries recognized Raskolnikov not as a villain, but as a reflection, flawed, yes, but earnest in his yearning for a better world. That made the novel dangerous. This wasn't a simple morality tale. It was a psychological grenade tossed into the middle of Russia's turbulent soul. And Dostoevsky wasn't just critiquing radicalism. He was critiquing a deeper idea, that man could engineer utopia by discarding conscience, history, and God. That belief, so central to the revolutionary dreams of the 19th century, was what Dostoevsky feared most. He believed that without spiritual grounding, reason alone could justify any cruelty. Raskolnikov's breakdown was Dostoevsky's answer. It wasn't just about guilt. It was about the soul rebelling against its own betrayal. Later, as Crime and Punishment spread across Europe and the world, its reception evolved. In France, the existentialists, particularly Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, saw in Dostoevsky a kindred spirit. Camus even called the brothers Karamazov one of the greatest explorations of freedom and responsibility ever written. For the existentialists, Raskolnikov embodied the terrifying liberty of modern man, free to choose, free to act, but also condemned to bear the weight of those choices. They admired how Dostoevsky portrayed a man unmoored from tradition, grappling with meaning, morality, and mortality in a godless world. In many ways, they saw crime and punishment not as a cautionary tale, but as a roadmap to authenticity, provided one could endure the existential consequences. In the West, the novel also became a staple in academic circles. Psychologists praised Dostoevsky's insights into the mind. Freud himself admired his work. Educators saw it as a masterclass in character study. Moral philosophers debated its implications. And readers kept reading generation after generation, drawn to the book's dark gravity. Even today, in high schools and universities, crime and punishment remains a rite of passage. Why? Because we still live in Raskolnikov's world. A world where people are isolated in crowded cities. A world where idealism crashes into economic desperation. A world where many quietly ask themselves, what if I don't matter? Or worse, what if nothing matters? Dostoevsky doesn't answer these questions with easy affirmations. He doesn't wrap the story in a redemptive bow, but he does point to something. A path, a whisper. That whisper says, look closer, at yourself, at others, at the pain behind the anger, the fear behind the violence, the love buried under shame. That's why crime and punishment belongs in our Level 5 playlist, because it speaks to that moment in life when we awaken, not just to our own inner contradictions, but to the structures around us. We see that law is not always justice. That power can wear the mask of virtue. That systems shape behavior in ways we barely perceive. And we face a choice. Do we conform for comfort, or do we press on towards something deeper? That is Raskolnikov's arc, and perhaps ours too. But what elevates the novel from brilliant to immortal is its humanity. Dostoevsky could have made Raskolnikov a simple monster, a cautionary example. Instead, he made him a question, an ache, a search, and he surrounded him with people who, despite their suffering, choose to love anyway. Sonia, Razumikin, even Porphyry, each offers a version of grace. None of them are perfect, but in a world that's cracked and cruel, they offer connection. And maybe that's the real message. That salvation doesn't come from philosophy or punishment, but from presence. From the quiet, stubborn love of another human being who refuses to give up on you, even when you've given up on yourself. In our final section, we'll wind down with a slow, deep reflection on the quiet brilliance of Dostoevsky's vision and why it continues to matter now in this restless age of distraction and doubt. The final pages of Crime and Punishment close not with a flourish, but with a murmur, soft, understated, yet laden with tremors of change. Raskolnikov, sentenced to Siberia for his crime, lives among the condemned. His body survives, but his spirit still drifts, suspended somewhere between justification and surrender. He remains distant, hollowed out, even in the company of Sonia, who follows him to this barren exile. But then something turns. It's not dramatic. No angel choir, no lightning bolt of remorse. Just a gesture, a glance. Sonia is there, always near, silent yet unwavering. And one day, as spring begins to stir beneath the snow, Raskolnikov reaches out, not just physically, but spiritually. He sees her, really sees her, and in that gaze lies the faintest flicker of rebirth. That moment is perhaps Dostoevsky's most radical claim. Not that guilt leads to punishment, or that crime erodes sanity. Those are too simple. What Dostoevsky ultimately suggests is that love, patient, undeserved, unrelenting love, is what saves us. Not the law, not suffering, not ideology, but the quiet presence of someone who sees your brokenness and still chooses to stay. This is the closing gift of the novel. Not closure, but possibility. Raskolnikov does not become a saint overnight. His heart is not instantly healed, but the soil has been tilled. The thaw has begun. And in Siberia, of all places, something sacred begins to bloom. Now let's pause. Breathe. You've walked through alleys of fevered thoughts, courtroom cat-and-mouse games, dusty apartments soaked in shame and longing. You've endured the crushing weight of conscience and the strange tenderness of human connection. And here we are, still turning pages in the dark, still searching, as Dostoevsky once did, for what lies beneath the surface of man. Still asking, what does it mean to be free? To be human? To be forgiven? This novel doesn't answer those questions, but it honors them. It sits with them, and maybe that's enough. So, as we drift into our closing wind down, just let yourself feel the quiet ache this story leaves behind. The ache of truth half spoken, of redemption just within reach, of lives splintered and slowly stitched back together by something more powerful than words. Now we slow down. So now, as the night settles around us like a thick velvet curtain, let yourself drift gently, slowly, into a space where questions can soften and time loosens its grip. Picture Raskolnikov sitting beneath a Siberian sky, where the stars shimmer like ancient witnesses to a million whispered regrets. Picture Sonia nearby, holding not answers, but the steadfast silence of someone who believes love is action, not explanation. They don't speak. They don't need to. In the hush of exile, something more honest takes root, a kind of beginning where once there was only endings. And maybe in your own quiet, you can sense it too. That flicker, that idea that even our darkest thoughts don't disqualify us from light. That even when we fall again, fall completely, there's a hand that might still reach for us. Or a story, like this one, that reminds us we're not alone in the falling. Dostoevsky didn't give us heroes to worship. He gave us human beings to understand. And through their confusion, their shame, their trembling hope, he gave us permission to hold our own contradictions with a little more compassion. So now, as your thoughts begin to blur and the world hushes into its late-night hush, carry that with you. The hush of forgiveness, the hush of understanding, the hush that says, you are flawed, yes, but never beyond reach. Close your eyes, let the stillness wrap around you, and let yourself sleep as the city of St. Petersburg fades and the search for meaning drifts into dreams. Sweet dreams.